There was always this gap of just never being enough. We need to upgrade our software and how we talk to ourselves. That was the start of the change of my life for sure. Know what you want, understand what it takes, do the work day in, day out. And when you do that, the consistency is going to reward you.
High performance is something that we talk quite a lot about on this podcast. And the individual you're about to meet is extremely qualified to talk about high performance from a few different areas. In particular, wealth building, personal development, and more that you're going to learn about from how this individual curates his frameworks, how he builds his audiences, how he captures and keeps attention. I'm extremely excited to welcome a creator, a wealth builder, an entrepreneur, a athlete, a husband and a father, Mr. Clint Murphy. How are you today, sir?
Great. Thank you for having me. And thanks for that beautiful, wonderful intro. It's always crazy when someone on the other side talks about you because, a lot of people who are in the seat you're in or in the seat I am in, a lot of the reason we achieve is we never feel like we're doing enough. And when someone else speaks it back to you, you kind of listen and say, "Oh, that sounds pretty cool."
We look at high performance and we think about what we're not doing, right? There's that level of, the gap. What does that feel like for you?
It's always changed. And so if I look back to my childhood, I would say there was always this gap of just never being enough. I did the psychoanalysis, the shadow work when I was older and realized a lot of it came down to when I was younger with my older brother. My dad's attention was always on him, just always focused on, no matter what I did. Like if I played sports for 6 straight hours, if I won a championship, it was always like, what did your brother do? Was your brother with you? And it wasn't until later in life, like 40, where I said, "Hey, Dad, like that kind of scarred me a little." It's really led to this always trying to be more, whether it's my finances, every category you listed. And he wrote me back a few days later and said, "Son, I was never worried about you. I was worried about your brother." And it was, like it brought me to tears because this gap of never being enough and always pushing for the next thing was he actually wasn't worried. Like I didn't even need to do more. He was already comfortable with where I was. Yet I always thought I wasn't enough for him. That doesn't mean I slowed down. It just means I'm not being pushed by an irrational child's need to make his dad happy. Now I push because that's what I've learned to love to do and learned to love to look for that next challenge and say I'm going to achieve it. Not from a place of emptiness necessarily anymore or a longing or a desire to please someone, but to say to myself, I like getting shit done. I like conquering big goals. Let's go have some fun.
I think you kind of show yourself what you're capable of at that point. You're like, well, now that I've set the bar for myself, there's no point in going backwards, right? And I feel like professional athletes or high performers in general, and I want to segment it too, because just because you're a professional athlete or a pro at anything doesn't necessarily make you a high performer, right? Like we see regression all the time. In fact, I remember, I think it was either Kobe or MJ. I think it was Kobe who I was reading about, and he was talking about how once he figured out the amount of money that a player needed to make and they reached that threshold, they would get complacent. And so he understood mentally, like, this was going to be like, I believe, like, quote, taking candy from a baby, because there was just a completely different drive. So we talked about that gap, right? And,
Yeah.
skills, knowledge, power. How did you start to fill the gap after you filled that and answered that question from your father? How did you start to fill the gap for yourself and keep that level of high performance at the status quo?
It's always evolved along the way. So I would say for my first 32-ish years, it was sheer brute force, work long hours, get shit done, move ahead in your career. but I wasn't achieving at the level I needed to. And there were three big inflection points in my life that shifted me, and they've led to a how I view the world and how I view most people need to work on themselves. And I'll highlight, they didn't go in the right order, but I'll highlight what the three of them are for you. And then we can dive into the first one probably because it was pretty impactful. One is our hardware. So what is that subconscious wiring that happens in our childhood? So take the example I gave. Part of my hardware was I couldn't please my father. I needed to do more. So that was hardwired into me as this need to just keep pushing right through the wall, right? Like I'm going to burn out in every area of my life because I have to prove myself to this man who didn't show me that when I was young. That's your hardware. We need to replace our hardware. Number two is the software. So the software is how we talk to ourselves in our head. What is that voice telling you? And the more research you do, the more reading you do, cognitive behavioral therapy is something I love for that, which led me to Stoicism, which I love. And I also am a fan of Buddhism. So I look at Stoicism and Buddhism almost as an active philosophy, and Buddhism a little more passive, right? So Stoicism, will I accept that thought? No, I'm not going to let it persist. Buddhism, just let the thought go. Don't even grab onto it, right? So active versus passive. So one is that's the software. We need to upgrade our software and how we talk to ourselves. We can't let our mind control how we behave. We have to take charge and control our mind. The third one then becomes the operating systems. How are we living our life on a day-to-day basis? And I would say that was the first one around 31. At an incident where I was at a party. One of the women there was talking about a run she'd done. I was congratulating her, and a friend shit talked me about it and said, "You couldn't even do that." And I'd always been a runner growing up. I mean, it was something I'd done. So I just shot back off the cuff. Yeah, I could, right? But now you look at it and we're taking away one. I mean, it was just a horrible situation. We're taking away from her moment. This isn't meant to be an argument between two friends. Like I'm celebrating something she's done. Anyway, we make a bet. The day of the bet, it snowed here in Vancouver, and he lets me out on a phone call, and he says, "Besides, the look in your eye when we made the bet was enough for me." So one, bad friend. He's no longer in the circle, not surprisingly. And two, that night laying in bed, I had a triathlete magazine. I'd done some small ones when I was younger, and I'd always done Ironman in my head, right? So we always hear this. You think about things and you get the dopamine rush. So you don't actually do the things. You think about making $1 million, but then you don't go do it. You think about completing the Ironman, but then you don't go do it. And so that was the first time I looked at, I think it was a half Ironman. I said to my wife, "I'm going to sign up for this." She was like, "Yeah, whatever." Because she didn't believe it, right? All those times that I'd said I was going to do something that I hadn't. And it was the first time where I implemented Stephen Covey's begin with the end in mind. I'm going to do this half Ironman in 9 months. I need to, and not anything big. I need to buy a pair of running shoes. I need to get my bike tuned up, and I need to sign up for a class on how to not be afraid of the water because I had fear of open water. So I started as small as I possibly could, straight out of 7 Habits. I like, here's the end goal. I'm going to bring it all the way down to the smallest chunks that I can achieve. And I'm going to start to stack those until I get there. A year later, 9 months later, I do the half Ironman, complete it. A year after that, I do an Ironman, lose maybe 30 to 40 pounds along the way. But that was the first time it taught me this: know what you want, understand what it takes, do the work day in, day out. And when you do that, the consistency is going to reward you. Even though operating systems is number 3 on my list, in terms of the way I went through it, getting good operating systems was number 1. Because once I completed that Ironman, I realized whether it was physical, whether it was financial, whether it was my career, I could achieve whatever I want simply by taking it all the way down to what are those daily habits that I need to have that will stack up, that will lead to the weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual 5-year goals that I want to achieve. And that was the momentum. 32, when I made that change, that was the start of the change of my life for sure.
I was speaking to a Michigan State Supreme Court Justice Richard Bernstein. He's been on the podcast, blind from birth, over 20 marathons run, Ironman, just savage athlete. We talked about something similar that you're outlining where, because I had asked him, like, I know as someone who does physically hard things, like, what's the carryover? We hear about it a lot from super fit people who are extremely motivating and, say like, once you accomplish this massively hard thing, you'll be able to do anything in your day, right? The workout's the hardest part in your day. Well, what happens when the workout's not the hardest part of your day anymore, right? But that's a separate conversation. But Justice Bernstein said it's that you're teaching the spirit how to overcome. Like you're teaching your spirit how to power through those difficult situations and those hard things. And he outlined his experience in those particular moments. And it sounds like you also in the Ironman had an extremely profound moment upon finishing, where the rest of your life is now in front of you because you see the power of compounding, the power of habit formation, beginning with the end in mind, and all of these different frameworks and sentiments that we hear a lot about, but you showed the practice of, right? Because I think something that as a podcaster, as a guy trying to make it, if you will, in this world, however, whatever the right frame of mind is, we hear these high level strategies of consistency, discipline, dedication, and no one really understands that, regardless of if you hear Michael Jordan or Clint Murphy. It's hard for people maybe to distill and understand in practice what it looks like if you're starting from zero, or maybe you're at 50%, how you could get over the hump. So maybe say someone is struggling in their 9 to 5, wants a bit more fulfillment out of life. They stumble across your content and they hear you talk about the power of compounding and how their whole life could be in front of them. What's maybe something that you'd like to share with that individual who's currently going through that transitional phase of life?
It's hard because what we're going to say and the way we're going to talk about it is simple. But simple isn't easy. And what people want to hear on that other side, a lot of times, is the hack, the cheat code, what makes it easy. But none of the things you and I are going to talk about today are ever easy. Yeah, I'm going to get up at 4:50 tomorrow and make the 5:30 class to work out because I want to lose weight and I want to have a rhythm and routine now that I've left my job. I never used to wake up at a number that had a 4 in it. I've only started doing it the last 3 months. I'm 45 years old. Normally I stay up till 11, 12 at night. That's fucking hard, but it's for a purpose. And so whoever's listening to this, they have to have I read this and it stuck with me. When you want to create a new habit, when you want to achieve something, the pain of not doing it or the pleasure of doing it have to exceed stasis. And almost everyone who's listening to this is too friggin' happy with their life to make that change. Right? Think about why I made that change. Because some dickhead of a friend made me feel like a piece of shit. Boom. The pain of feeling that way was worse than the stasis of just being a lazy, fat couch potato. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't accept it. I actually needed him to shock me into action. We can tell the people that are on the other side of the call, it's simple. Know what you want. And once you know what you want, right, do the deep work, say, hey, and start small. For whoever is listening to this, that's the key. For whoever who is listening to this that hasn't achieved something big, what we want them to do is we want them to do something super simple. because we want them to train themselves that they are someone who can complete their goals. So make it something as simple as every morning when I wake up and I brush my teeth, I'm going to brush my teeth at this time and I'm going to look at a certain spot on the wall in my bathroom while I do it, while I count to 60, right? Brush your teeth for 60 seconds while looking at the exact same spot on the wall. 30 days later, you've done that 30 days in a row. Holy shit, you've got your first streak. Now let's make a little bit of a harder streak. Every morning after I brush my teeth, I'm going to do 5 push-ups. I'm going to do that every day for 30 days in a row. Okay, I got that done. Now I'm going to start walking around the block. I'm going to do my 5 push-ups. I'm going to walk around the block. That's it. Just a walk around the block. And then after that month, it's two blocks. Then it's 3 blocks. Then we're running a block. Then we're running 2 blocks, right? And then we're running a mile. And then we're running 2 miles. So we're going to start as small as we possibly can. And we're going to be consistent in the one thing for 30 days. We're going to make sure same time, same activity every day, 30 days. And when they do that, they teach themselves that they are someone who can do what they set their mind to. And then we're going to say, okay, now let's start to do some meaty things. Now let's set that bigger goal. And then on the understand what it takes, it's anything you and I want to do, someone has already achieved, right? Like neither of us is going to be like, hey, let's start a rocket company. Like, and even if we did, we could go see how Elon did it. But we're going to do something that's smaller. We're going to say, hey, I want to make $1 million, or I want to do a marathon, or I want to run an Ironman. We're going to pick things that are in the realm of feasibility. And there's someone who's done them. So we can find a roadmap on how to do it. And then the next step simply becomes we have to show up and do it every day. And that we now have the ability to do because we took that step to say, I'm going to train myself on these smaller activities. And you have to recognize, if you're listening to this and we're talking about the pain versus pleasure and being greater than where you are today, if you recognize that that's not the case, then the only way to have it is to make it yourself. You have to recognize my pain of being where I am now may not be great enough to move, but I want to move. And I'm going to make the decision to move. And then you take the action.
I love how you broke that down, simple, actionable steps. And also, I'm sure you're familiar with the quote, the pain of discipline weighs ounces, the pain of regret weighs tons.
Oh, that's a beauty.
That's one of my favorite ones. And when you break it down like that, I mean, habit formation is extremely key. And, I know we opened a couple loops and I want to close them for the audience where you had outlined hardware, software, and the operating system. I had stoicism metaphorically aligned with the operating system. And it sounds like you had kind of segmented it into the software based on how which I guess are kind of like the same thing when you think about it. But I think it's extremely important how you analogized the human experience when it comes to synthesizing and distilling trauma or any type of memory or present experience that somebody has, because now there's a meaningful way to understand and look at their life in different ways to say, like, where am I already operating from a perspective of like, these are my tastes and these are like my predetermined ways of viewing the world, and then kind of unlearning some of those things so this way they could start to form new patterns and habits.
Yes.
I always refer to this book, The Body Keeps the Score. Did you ever read it?
Yeah. I don't know that I read it, but Vanderkook, right?
A little bit more background on me. I mean, my audience knows at this point, I was 3 years, I served 3 years as a criminal prosecutor in the Bronx, special victims. And so I read that book at the time during COVID, where I was also getting to another level of fitness. little bit unreasonable, and also prosecuting domestic violence crimes. And reading that book, tracking my data real time on a Whoop, and so everything was kind of firing on all cylinders. And I'd also discovered Stoicism at the time, so you can imagine how all that was just like making me flip a switch. When I hear you talk about how people can in, internalize their human experience differently and take it step by step, the next kind of thing that comes to mind is, self improvement. You're someone who has accumulated quite an audience across the topic of self improvement. And just to run a couple numbers real quick, LinkedIn, near 90,000 followers, Twitter, over 350,000 followers. And that is a massive responsibility. And I first came across your content learning about wealth building and I'm someone who has a JD MBA, but the way you distill an income statement, a balance sheet, and all of those carousels were like way better than almost any textbook I'd ever read, because I didn't need to like go look anything up from the textbook. It was like, oh yeah, well, I remember studying that. It's a lot differently now. When did you realize you had a talent for distilling information into such simple, actionable steps?
You don't realize it till people tell you, right? And but I would say I actually realized it maybe 10 to 12 years ago. And I try to say this to young people. I talk about in some of my writing, I talk about the concept of rare skills. And you're a perfect example of someone who's doing that right now, Jonathan. Is you look at it, in my background was an accountant, right? I'm a CFO by day, although now I've left that company and I'm starting my own real estate development shop. But I'm an accountant, yet I take Toastmasters. I work on public speaking. I have a podcast. I'm reading, now I'm averaging 40, 50 books a year. I'm learning how to write in multiple different formats. And so now when you combine those skills, you become someone who is different from almost anybody, because there's not many people that come up and can have an easy flowing conversation with you. And then you're like, oh, what do you do? And you're like, oh, I'm an accountant. You're like, nah, I don't believe that. Right. It doesn't mix. What I noticed when I was younger was that if you could convey complex information, or even take a step back, if you wanted to move up the ladder, you had to be able to convey complexity simply. And so when you're sitting down with the owner of a company who's worth hundreds of millions of dollars and you want to talk to him about the cash flow, you can't you can't be vague. You can't not give him exactly what he needs as fast as you can. You need to be able to say, this is what I'm seeing. This is what the cash flow is telling me. These are the three things I think you should do. And so early in my career, probably wrote way too much. And then you start to read books like Brief, which is, how to say more with less. And you take those concepts and you realize when you're trying to teach something to someone and you only have 280 characters, you've got to say it tight. So everything you've seen on LinkedIn in those carousels, those were individual tweets. And so learning how to write a thread to say, I'm going to break a balance sheet down for you in 7 minutes, and just boom, 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 like assets are what you own, liabilities are what you owe, equity is what you're worth. It's like, oh, okay, I get it now. Like, make it that simple. The more I climbed the ladder and the more I sat down with owners of companies and had to convey these topics as quickly and not just efficiently, but effectively as possible, that taught me how to do it later for my audience. And then if you can do that for the balance sheet, you can do that for anything you're reading about or learning. So you can have a conversation like you and I are now. I could have that on my podcast. And then I could say, hey, what are the top 9 things I picked up in that conversation or in that person's book? Let's write a thread on that book. Let's summarize my takeaways in one thread.
I mean, it's very similar in the law, but like the main thing that I took away from you just now was how when you're sitting down with someone, exceptional net worth, you can't be vague. And that is such a powerful thought, because when you learn how to distill the information, convey it with simplicity, brevity. I mean, Bruce Lee, right? Simplicity is brilliance. That is an immense power that I feel like is extremely difficult to learn. And something else that you talk about is acquiring rare skills. And we hear a lot about the creator stack, right? Like being able to have a multi-layer skill set that is, the copywriting, the video editing, the face to camera, the, understand how to write the hook and everything. But for the purposes of this conversation in the context of wealth building, you've simplified wealth building for
Mhm.
your audience, myself included. Is wealth building as hard as everybody makes it? Or are we kind of overestimating what it takes to become a millionaire?
Well, let's take a step back. Almost everything is simpler than people try to make it because they can't sell you a course, right? So there's a thread or a newsletter I want to write about. I try to boil almost anything out there into 3 bullet points. Two's not enough. And once you get to 4, you might as well sell your PDF course. So I try to boil everything down to 3 bullet points. When you think about wealth generation, it really is as simple as earn more, spend less, and invest in ETFs. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. And then you get into the nuance. People are like, oh, well, it's easy to say earn more. And it's like, well, like, yeah, we can go into like the 10 different ways you can do that, right? You can have a side hustle. Here's 10 of those you can have. You can get promoted at work. Have you asked? Here's a post on how to ask for a promotion. If you've asked and you've been turned down, have you thought of going to a new company? Have you worked when you want to earn more money? What you're getting paid is what you are worth. So when we talk about rare skills, when we talk about building yourself up, when we talk about self improvement, those are all ways you can make more money because you now are worth more. You have a different skill set, a more valuable skill set, and that employer will pay for it, or a different employer will pay for it. Or you can earn money on the side with side hustles, right? On the spending, you just say, you start to recognize the difference between wants and needs. And you say, hey, I'm going to focus on my needs. I'm going to pay myself first. I'm going to take 30% of my paycheck and just put that straight into my investment account. Hopefully, you have an employer match program. You're always going to take advantage of an employer match. If you have kids and there's a program that allows kid matching of what you put in for their college, you're going to do that so that you're saving for them when they're young. And then whatever's left over is what you get to have fun with. That's it. Whatever's left over is what you get to have fun with. You don't get to have fun, barely cover the needs, and then have nothing to invest. Get the needs out of the way, put away 20 to 30% of what you're making, and then have fun. Now, here's an important caveat, right? Is that's easy to say coming from my position, high earner. Well, now I actually have no job, so no earnings. But for most of my career, I was consistently 15% raises almost every year for the last 25 years, kind of thing. I didn't get my spending under control till later. I wish I'd gotten it under control earlier. Probably got it under control at about 34. And it's probably not that much of a coincidence that within 2 or 3 years of really diving deep into financial independence and learning it and studying it and reading every article Mr. Money Mustache had ever written, within 3 years of that, I became a millionaire. 2 years later, was a multi-millionaire, and it was just all of a sudden it was every dollar I make has a purpose. And I started thinking, Jonathan, in terms of deposits, like Ramit Sethi put out a post the other day that said, who actually thinks like this? And it was someone thinking about a deposit on a house versus something. And I was like, actually, I quote tweeted it and I said, for the last decade, I've always thought in deposits. So if a friend was like, do you want to go to a Super Bowl? I'd be like, that's a deposit. It's a deposit on an apartment. So I could go to the Super Bowl or I could buy an income producing asset. Now, obviously, at that stage, I'm making more money than the average person where I'm thinking of that, but it just gives you an example of the way you think. Now, you get back to that person who I'm saying put 20% away. There's so much of America who's living paycheck to paycheck. So for them, the first thing we have to do is get out of that. We have to get to the point where their bases are covered, where they're not living paycheck to paycheck. So that's going to be cutting the spend, and it's going to be increasing the earnings. And that has to be the sole focus until they get out of that cycle where they're constantly stressed because you can't make the right decisions when you're in there. So let's increase the earnings as fast as possible. Let's upgrade our skills. Let's get an opportunity to make more money. Once we're there, then we can start to assess and say, how do I increase my saving? How do I decrease my spend? And what do I invest in? And I'm never going to tell anyone to invest in anything other than just put your money in the market and let the market do the work. I'm not sophisticated enough to suggest to any other human how they should invest. My personal style tends to be real estate because that's what I do for a living.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inside the Inspired. My name is Jonathan Cohen, and I have a quick favor to ask you. If you're getting any value out of this content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. You help us reach more people, and you can also stay up to date with all the latest content coming your way. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll catch you in the episode.
What do people misunderstand about money? What is it that people are missing? Because we talked about the spending, right?
Yeah.
And I think that probably is a really big portion of it. And you had
It's a big one.
outlined the old train of thought, this is a deposit, versus, a deposit on an apartment versus a trip to the Super Bowl. But what is it that people misunderstand about money, in your opinion?
Two things. One, that I put a YouTube video out on this the other day, is we're taught money is evil. And so if you look at cartoons, you just introduced me to your 9-month-old daughter, and you're going to put some cartoons on her for her as she gets older, and you're going to watch things like Aladdin, and you're going to see that Jafar is the evil guy who wants all the gold and the rubies, because the bad guy always wants the money. And Aladdin, yeah, he wants some gold, but he's a poor person who needs to get out of the slums. And in almost every story you see, that's the case. Bad, evil, generally man, rich, young woman, young boy, poor, in the slums, hero, right? And every story is like that. Look at The Simpsons, and you got Montgomery Burns just rubbing his fingers together as he plots to destroy Homer's life. Like, legit, seriously, in what real world is some billionaire who owns the nuclear power plant like really worried about the life of the dude who like eats donuts and drinks beer and works in the control room? Like, zero, right? But he's the evil guy. So this gets into our DNA. Like, our parents tell kids, we don't talk about money. Money's a secret. Don't talk about it. We don't, like, money is the root of all evil. Money doesn't buy happiness. Just think of all these quotes that are anti-money, and all these cartoons and all these comics and what our parents tell us. So people have this inherent distrust of money. They have a bit of a fear of it, and it creates a scarcity mindset that there's never enough. They can't earn enough. If you have money, Jonathan, that must mean I have less money. So that's one, right? Is you have to overcome that. Again, that's software, or sorry, hardware. You have to overcome that hardware. On the software side, you have this, what I call, Kardashian effect, that's really bad today. So back in the day, if we wanted to see how the rich people lived, once a week you'd flip on Robin Leach's Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, champagne something and caviar dreams, right? And that was the only time you really saw how rich people live. And then the Kardashians come along and they're like, we're going to become billionaires by just showing people how rich people live. That's our skill, is just showing you a lifestyle that you will never be able to have. And all of a sudden you have all these influencers on all these platforms, and I mean, social media, that are showing everybody what other people have. And everybody who's posting is posting front of stage. You know, here's my LV bag. Here's my this. They're in the effing store with the bag in their hand, take the photo, and then they put it back on the friggin' shelf. But you think your friend now has an LV bag or you know, a Lambo that they rented. You know, I call them Lambo loaners and jet renters. And then they take these photos, and now all of a sudden you're just always thinking you don't have enough. You're always thinking you're behind. And so keeping up with the Joneses has gone to a level that it never should have gone to. So rich people don't feel the need to keep up. They spend on what they need and they save a lot. People who don't have money are trying to keep up with what they think they need to keep up with. And so they're spending on things they shouldn't spend on. And I'll pick on my own brother a little on this one. Maybe 20 years ago, you know, when flat screen TVs were pretty expensive, we had a small one. You know, like we bought one of the first LEDs, like it was probably like 27 inches, maybe 31. Like that's tiny, right? You're thinking like we both have computer monitors bigger now. But that was like an expensive TV, and we bought it with cash. That's like what we did. We've ever since we've been together, and she started to teach me. We've never carried, between my wife and I, we've been together 29 years. We never carried a credit card balance. And then my, you know, like a year or so later, my brother has like this like 40-inch flat screen TV, and I know what he makes, and I'm like, hey, like, what are you doing? And he's like, what? Like, I just got a TV. And I'm like, yeah, but you can't afford that. And he's like, well, you got one. And I'm like, yeah, but I paid for mine in cash. Like, what did you do? And it's one of these layaway programs, don't pay for a year, but then after a year, if you haven't fully paid for it, it's like a retroactive 30% interest rate, right? And there's no way he's paid for it in a year. So you look at that, and that I think is on supercharge, like the credit card debt, the consumer debt. I always talk about leverage because I use a lot of leverage to grow my wealth, but there's good leverage and there's bad leverage. If I'm using leverage to buy real estate, that's one thing. But if you're using leverage to afford your lifestyle, you're effed. Like that is a recipe for disaster. That's a recipe for consumer debt, credit card debt, and eventually bankruptcy. Because once you get behind, unless you change your ways, you can't get out. It's negative compounding.
Man, it's powerful and it's always scary because, you know, that's how a lot of the country lives. And it's how we're kind of conditioned to live, right? Like the keeping up with the Joneses mentality and vilifying the guy or girl who wants to make money. And the lifestyle thing is definitely real. Like trying to match your friends or not having enough humility to say, I can't afford this, or finding more words for your words that aren't necessary to afford something. But you mentioned about the earning more in a situation like that, right? Well, at some point, what happens when they do, when that individual does earn more, right? Like, what if they're spending ahead of where they are right now, but they see themselves as someone who can earn more in the future, and the lifestyle stays the same? Is it fair to say that maybe there's a chance for that person to potentially outrun the leveraged lifestyle they're leading today?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be in that category. You know, and that's Bill Perkins' Die with Zero. And he refers to that as borrowing from your future earnings to live the lifestyle you want today. And he looks at it and says, hey, if you know you're someone who, you know, you look back and I say, I got a 15% raise on average every year for 20 years. Well, if I know that's going to happen and I'm doing the learning, I'm doing the studying, I'm in the right career track, I'm in the right path, that I know that's going to happen, then I don't need to put away 30% of my earnings in my early years. I can live a good life and enjoy myself and say, hey, I'm going to set my baseline. My baseline's this, and I'm going to spend that. And in the early years, that's going to lead to deficits. And eventually it's going to lead to surplus. Now, it's only going to lead to surplus if at some point I lower, I don't inflate my spend. And we call this lifestyle creep, right? As a lawyer, other lawyers who are going through it. You don't let your lifestyle keep going up with, and I look at mine, and I wish I had read what I read 3 or 4 years earlier, because by the time I caught myself, I'd already inflated to a certain lifestyle where I was pretty happy, and I was like, no, this is a good life. I like it. I'm not going to inflate it. My boss was always like, hey, you should go on more vacations. You should buy a nicer car and upgrade this. And, your boss tells you that because they want you in debt so you can never leave your job. From that moment on, though, we didn't really inflate. If anything, I cut a little, right? It was like, okay, I'm going to spend less money on this, but we're going to still do this type of vacation. We're still going to own this type of property, but put that freeze in place. And so if they know they're going to continue to have an upward trajectory in earnings, then why not borrow from that? And like everyone's like, oh, but the compounding. Well, like legitimately, like if you're talking about the type of earnings you're talking about, you're going to be making enough in your 30s that you can ignore your 20s and put a lot away in your 30s and do fine. But the math does show that if you start early and you let the compounding do the work, it will be beneficial. I do hear what you're saying though, and you can borrow from those future years, but really I think that's a very small percentage of the population who's getting into those positions where uh, what I'm hearing from you is you're getting to those positions where you're earning 300, 400,000 plus dollars a year. And you're like, hey, when I'm making 50, I can go a little bit of a deficit because I know in 3 years I'm going to be making 200. Like you're at a big law firm and the progression of salaries, right? But the average person out there, those jumps aren't going to cover their overspending early.
I think it's important to distinguish the two, right? Because some people play this game of rationalization, and Stephen Pressfield, author of The War of Art, has been on the podcast, and I'm sure you've read his book. And if not, you definitely would like it. And he talks about rationalization as a form of resistance and how we put ourselves in these positions, kind of like these echo chambers in our own minds, just justifying every action that we take. Oh, I'll make it up in the future. Oh, I'm about to earn X amount, and therefore I can afford this flat screen TV, this car, this asset, right? That isn't really so much of an asset because it depreciates the second it leaves the lot. Like, there's so many different approaches that we use to justify our behavior, but the reality is, the bill eventually does come due. And, as a professional, you absolutely have outlined a few different strategies for the listener, for including myself, to consider when it comes to placing a value on wealth building, what that really looks like. Now, in terms of ideas, you have quite a few of them. And you've leveraged those ideas into the creator audience that I alluded to before. How do you know when you've stumbled on a good idea or thought of a good idea that could benefit the masses? What's your process in testing, whether it be finance or personal development? How do you go about your creative process, if you will, when it comes to distilling these high-level frameworks like we talked about?
I'm going to steal from a friend, Brad Stulberg, who's another great author, and he talks about a stool. And so he likes things that have been around for a long time. So they've stood the test of time. They are scientifically backed, so science supports them, and they are easy to implement. So if you can have all three of those, then it's a home run, right? If you look at something like cognitive behavioral therapy, I mean it's falling out of stoicism. Boom, it's been around for thousands of years. Okay, that's test of time. The research on CBT is one of the highest performing protocols for helping people with depression, etc. Okay. Is it easy to implement? Yeah, certain aspects, super easy. The one that I come to is thought auditing. It's one of the most powerful change. It created the most powerful change in my life by far, without a doubt, and is why I'm here today. And so you look at that and say, okay, I should write about that. I should interview people who talk about CBT on my podcast. I should go deep on stoicism. I should talk to people who know about stoicism. I should write about it. And the other one I'm a big fan of is lived experience. So I was recording with someone last night and he was asking me, all these things that I've been doing over the last 3 years while I try to build the audience that you talked about earlier, while I'm a full time CFO, while I'm a dad, while I'm a husband. And he said, well, what would you say to that single mother out there who wants to do something similar? And it's such a hard thing for me to say. Like, I don't know what it's like to be a single mother. I have no comprehension. And so for me to try to say, this is the recipe would be a disaster. So I try as much as possible in my writing to write from lived experience. So the research or the book or whatever I read lit me up. And somehow I've used it in my life and said, hey, like this is practical. Those are the ones that bang. Those are the ones that really get the virality, because the audience, like anytime I've used ChatGPT or, AI to kind of write the thread or the newsletter, it hasn't resonated. But when you write from your heart, something that that works, and you tie it in to how it's worked for you. And Sean Purry was on David Perel's podcast, and they just played it on their podcast yesterday, My First Million. And he was talking about every story you tell, all a story is change. And if you read a lot about storytelling, you hear that a lot. Story is just change, right? And so when you're writing about a topic and you're like, hey, here was me, like guy that's getting embarrassed at a party by a friend who makes him feel like a piece of shit. Here's the change. Now here's me completing an Ironman 40 pounds lighter and conquering everything I do in life. You're like, okay, I want to know what that effing change was, because whatever you did in there took you from total loser, embarrassed fat guy to in decent shape, Ironman, multi-millionaire. Like what happened in the middle? Because that shit obviously worked. And that's where I try to write from, is that place. What are the things that I did that worked? And where did the lessons come from? And how do I share that? Oh, I lost your sound.
I was on mute, letting you speak. I think that relatability is definitely what resonates, as I reflect on my lived experiences, and I find that in conversations like this one, if I'm speaking from my heart and genuinely following my curiosity, writing in particular is a very unique skill that I feel like the internet has just completely reinvented how humans will communicate, right? But I think in recent years, as I've leaned more into the creator lifestyle, or I should say, the creator ecosystem, and I've met so many creators with these massive audiences ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions, and I study, or I think I study, how they capture and keep attention in this kind of economy. And you kind of hear those similar threads of right from lived experience, and create some form of tension, and make sure you hook the audience with something that you'll deliver on the promise that you make at the top, right? And open thought loops, all the principles at this stage, whether it's creating a YouTube video or writing a LinkedIn post or a Twitter post, or an X post, sorry. Telling a story in a video piece on Instagram, the principles are, and now I'm just speaking personally, like ingrained in me. But I feel that my execution on some principles, depending on the platform, has been, you know, not as in alignment with the principles as they should be. And I feel like the internet and learning how to storytell in particular has shifted just writing completely for me. And I don't know if it's
Yeah.
based on what the YouTube algorithm is suggesting to me or me following my curiosity in terms of wanting to be a creator, and you know, lean into that. But it's so cool to see how simplicity, like the like genuinely looking at a LinkedIn post and peeling back the curtain on it, or a Twitter thread and peeling back the curtain on it, or seeing how the Twitter creators, you know, how they succeed on LinkedIn or not, right? And all like navigating this whole creator economy has been one of the most rewarding and debilitating experiences of my career. But at the same time, it's so fulfilling to know that, you know, there are tools at creators' disposals to reinvent their content, discover their content, and and ideate on their content, iterate on their content, and improve and
Mhm.
improve and improve. And something that I know you've talked about quite a lot is, and I was just watching the Ed Sheeran documentary on Disney for whatever reason, so random, and he was talking about how if he saw street performers play one show, he was going to do 20. And then that just reminded
Yeah.
me of like MJ or Kobe, like taking, you know, Kobe with, you know, 3 practices for another player's 1, not including the game, right? So 3 practices a day plus the game. It's 4 times as much work in a day as the one individual over the course of the week. Like the numbers just MJ, 45 minutes early to practice, practicing every day. Like there's just so many examples of, you know, putting in the reps. And so as we round this thing out, I'm curious from your perspective, maybe advice for me personally or creators, aspiring creators out there, as they're looking to, you know, distill ideas that matter to them and want to share on the internet. How would you advise at a high level a creator maybe in their intermediate stage kind of take the next step?
Yeah, and you know, you talked earlier about Zach Progob and obsession, and you know, he's trying to kind of make that his trademark. But it's funny because almost anyone who achieves at a high level, uh, we've all had that. That's the key. You have to be obsessed, and you know, you talked about how do you get good at writing threads. Well, like when I started, they sucked, but I wrote a thread every single day for 70 straight days. And somewhere in there, we went from okay to we added 20,000 followers in a month. And then we did that every month consistently for 2 years. And it was reps, like it was the work, and it was studying what works. It was studying how does Sawhill write. Okay, let's go to the Readwise database and let's see who the top thread writers are. And let's go read every day what thread they write. Let's understand their style. Let's understand their hooks. Let's embody that. Let's take 2 or 3 courses and take what they got from the courses. All right, got that. Let's get, you know, books on copywriting, books on storytelling. Let's interview people who write those books on the podcast. And that's for that one thing. But it's like that for every single thing. And I'm reading a book right now by Scott Young about how to be great at anything. And not surprisingly, you know, I've just read the index so far, but it's a lot of what we're talking about, right? It's, you know, what do you want to be good at? You got to see. So you have to look at who's doing it. And, you know, he's got 5 different ways to think about seeing. And it's really the, you know, when I know what you want, understand what it takes. Seeing is the understand what it takes. And then step 3 is my step 3 is, you know, do the work. His next one is do, right? And he's got 4 or 5 things to think about there. And it's really about deliberate intentional practice, right? Kobe wasn't just going to practice. he was deliberately practicing. Like I remember hearing about when he was young, he would watch a player and he would watch a certain move and he would say, I'm going to make that move mine. And so let's take the Jordan fadeaway, right? And he was like, okay, I'm going to develop the fadeaway. And he would practice the fadeaway until he couldn't not do it, right? Like good people do things until they can do it. Great people do things until they can't not do it. And so now he has the fadeaway. Okay, Allen Iverson has this move. That's going to be mine too. And so he goes and takes that move and just consistently does the work. And then the last steps Scott talks about, and I haven't read the book yet, but I've kind of got the gist of it, is deliberate feedback, right? You can't just do the work. You have to get specific, timely feedback on the work that you're doing so that you know where to make the alterations. And even as you were talking, I was laughing because on the Kobe one, because I've been preaching that to my oldest son for a long time now. From an athleticism perspective, the kid has way better future than I ever had a chance for. He turns 16 next month. He's already 6 feet tall, 190 pounds, and he works out 2 to 3 plus times a day. And I'm like, hey, you're not working out enough. Your coach wants you to put on 20 pounds for football. How many calories do you need to eat a day? How much protein should you be taking? What supplements? Like every single day, you have to do that. You have to be obsessed. If your coach wants you to be 20 pounds heavier in 3 months, that means we have to put on this much weight per week, which means you need this many calories per day. It's just breaking it down again to that simplest element and then stacking it up. Do the 3 workouts a day. And if you do those 3 workouts a day, when you show up as a grade 11 student, you're going to be bigger, stronger, and faster than some of the kids who are in grade 12. And you'll get to play even though you're only in grade 11. And so that obsession, that desire, that bringing it back to the bare bones and then making sure you do that every single day until you can't help but win, that's what we need the audience to do. And a fun one for you and me, I heard this one yesterday and I tried it yesterday and it totally has a revolutionary difference, is the idea of state change before we record, right? So I'm going to do this one for all my YouTube videos now. Miss Excel does this for her videos. And it's this idea that before we press record, like, I've got a gym right beside me on the other side of this recording area. I'll do some curls, do some slam balls, do my Superman pose, right? Because when you do your Superman pose, it increases your testosterone and you come across as someone with more confidence for the next hour. And so if you do that quick pump, you do the Superman pose, you get on the air, like the animation that's going to come through the screen is going to be magnified. And I want to do this even when I'm writing, because if I'm writing and I'm tired and I'm exhausted, the word choices, the flow, it's shit. And my reader can feel that. But if I get a pump on and then I start hitting the keys with enthusiasm, that's going to come across in the writing. It's going to come across through the screen. So that's for you and me as creators, that has to become a big one. Every time we show up to create, boom, we show up as our best self. We show up full of energy that will come out of the page or through the screen. That's about it.
That's the kind of energy and insight I was looking for from someone who's amassed it in reality and virtually. You definitely delivered. And I know the audience has felt your presence here today. There's a question that I posed to all my guests I'll pose to you. If the future version of yourself from 10 years from now, assuming he's in that ideal spot, were to fly in and offer you some advice in order to get there, what do you think he would say to you?
Yeah, he's going to tell me I thought too small. He's going to tell me, your goal was 100 million a year by 2030 for revenue for the company I'm building, and 200 million a year by 2035. It should have been 200 plus million by 2030. It should have been 500 million by 2035. And even that's thinking small. Like the fact that I'm saying those numbers is small. Like why not do 1 billion a year, right? And there's nothing holding you back. Like to succeed in business, you only need 3 things. You need the ability to analyze a deal. You need the employees to execute on the deal, and you need the capital to do the deal. So all we need to do is put those 3 things together. So he's going to tell me I thought small ball. Is it Steve Schwartzman who, when he was going to create, I think it was I always get confused between BlackRock and Blackstone. I think it was Blackstone. And he went to his partner. He had a realization. They were going to raise like $100 million fund, I believe. And he went to him and he said, why don't we raise $1 billion? And his realization was like, the actual running of the fund wouldn't be that different between the $100 million fund and the $1 billion fund. So why effing raise $100 million? Like, if we're going to do this, let's go get the $1 billion. And that's what 10 years from now me would tell me is you were thinking too small.
Clint, this has been awesome, man. You have given me a lot to think about. I'm excited to read through the transcript. I'm excited to watch this interview back. Really cool to connect with you. Please let the audience know where they can connect with you.
Yeah, the best spot to find us is thegrowth.guide, thegrowth.guide. And that's our website. And it has links to Twitter. It has links to the newsletter, the podcast, and the various other social medias that we're playing with. YouTube is going to be the next one. Like that is the goal this year. Once we move 2 months from now, I'm going to start recording at YouTube every single day. Like, what is the lesson today? Just short, like that guy who drives to the gym and just talks to the camera. I'm just going to sit down at my desk at night. What's one lesson today young people need to know that I saw someone F up or I saw someone do well? What's one takeaway? So you'll start to see that by August, hopefully. Knock on wood.
I'm excited to check it out. Thank you so much for this, and look forward to having you back on the pod in the future, man.
Thank you. That was fun. Appreciate it.